Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Unmissable Movies with me, Sam Cox.
Stephen Hayes.
And Martin Hayes.
So, for those who've been listening to our first few episodes religiously, they'll be recognising that there's a new voice in the mix, Mart. So, explain yourself.
Well, thank you, chaps, for having me on. Let me just say I'm delighted to be guest appearing on this fledgling podcast. What an honour. I've listened to at least one of the previous... Thank you. I can feel the warmth already. I've listened to at least one of your previous podcasts, and I have to say, it wasn't terrible.
Thanks very much.
In fact, it was rather good. So, yeah, I'm obviously Steve's brother, and grew up with, obviously, Steve, and Sam as well, I've known from a very young age. We've watched many films together, many great memories, and I'm delighted to be speaking with you both about this fantastic film today.
So, Sam, what's the film?
So today we're talking about the 1996 movie Shine, starring Geoffrey Rush. And this is a good one for Martin to be joining in on, actually, because this is one that the three of us probably watched together quite a few times way back when. I've seen it a few times since, but there was certainly a season back there where we watched this movie a lot. And I think Martin and I are both piano players, and one of the reasons I loved this movie was because it was about the piano and sort of love Rachmaninoff and all of that. But watching it more lately, realizing how well it holds up just as a great film, whether you're into music or not. This is a biography. It's a film about the life of David Helfgott. It's a dramatized biography, and he's a lesser-known Australian piano prodigy who basically suffered a nervous breakdown during his early career as a concert pianist. And the movie sort of tells the story of three different phases. Helfgott as a young boy, as a late teen, early 20s, and then as an older man, kind of following his trauma and his fall from the limelight of this promising career.
So before we go into the reflections on the rewatch, it's a bit of a statement on our teenage selves that we watched this a number of times as teenagers. I seem to recall, as I was watching it, I remembered I actually was looking for a different piano film, and I don't know if you remember this, Mark, but we saw some random film about this guy who played piano, and I think he had some level of learning difficulties, and I tried to find that, and I ordered this from play.com thinking it was it. Can you remember that?
I can, and I remember even on the advent of the internet, which was obviously, we were probably given an opportunity to use the internet a few years after Shine was released. But I distinctly remember as soon as I had the opportunity to get on yahoo.com, I was on there looking up, trying to find the name of that film that we saw. I think we saw it in Ireland, and it was probably on the Irish equivalent of Channel 5, or possibly even a worse station if that's possible. And eventually I found it. I've never found the film to buy or to watch, but it was called Journey of the Heart, or Journey from the Heart. And it was starring, do you remember Sybil Shepherd? Very popular American actress, but primarily in soap operas, that sort of thing. I'm probably doing her a disservice there. She probably has done more credible work. But she appeared in that film Journey of the Heart, and yeah, and I do recall finding Shine and thinking before the internet had obviously was readily available, thinking, oh, this is the film that we watched once and that we've been searching for all these years. But it wasn't. As it turns out, happily, it was an even better film.
And Sybil Shepherd, if you're watching and you feel like he has done you a disservice, just let us know on unmissablemoviescontact@gmail.com, and we'll compensate you for your destroyed image. Sam, how did you find the rewatch of this one?
I really enjoyed it. I watched it last night, and it's different each time you watch this film. I think watching it a long time ago, the focus of it being about this piece of music that he's trying to master, and I think I made the mistake years ago of really equating his breakdown with his journey trying to learn this particular piano concerto, and so some of the story revolves around this sort of early 20s David Helfgott at the Royal College of Music in London, And in his attempt to master this mammoth elephantine piano concerto, the Rachmaninoff's third concerto, he essentially pushes him to breaking point. I think watching it this time, I really the whole sort of father son story and the broader sort of picture of their family history and that whole thing really kind of loomed a lot larger to me, and it changed the emphasis of the film as I watched it. But I really enjoyed it. It felt much more of an Australian film than I remember.
What do you mean by that, Sam?
Do you know what I mean? It's like, well, I just think, but years ago I watched it and just assumed it was, American, and but it just felt very Australian, and I was aware, just digging into the movie's production a bit, how much, it's filmed there, and a lot of the crew, the director, obviously, some of the cast, most of the cast, the editor. It's a very Australian movie, and I think actually it's probably one of the most successful Australian movies in terms of accolades and acclaim. But yeah, I enjoyed it. What about you?
Yeah. I think one critic actually called it Neighbours with a Piano, so I think you're right there. So, Mark, how did you find your rewatch of this?
Well, for me, this film was absolutely formative. So I was one of these kids who was very impressionable. So I would watch the Muppets and be convinced that I'd grow up to be a puppeteer, and sort of set my life on a trajectory whereby I could achieve that goal. or I'd watch Indiana Jones and think, I was destined to be some intrepid adventurer, travelling the world, getting into scrapes with the Nazis. In fact, on that, even when I watch Indiana Jones as an adult, I think, do you know what? I think I should jack it all in and just do an archaeology degree and live out my childhood dreams. But Shine for me was a funny one because it came along at just the right time. So I'm not a professional musician, but I play a number of instruments, like Sam and like you. But I was just discovering the piano, and I think it was probably the earlier film that we'd watched that sort of got me into it. And as I said, I was and probably still am quite impressionable. And watching Shine, I mean, what stood out to me, of course, was the virtuosic performances of the music of David Helfgott, or the actors playing David Helfgott, or his hands. And I thought, this was probably 13 or 14, and I thought I was totally persuaded that I was going to follow in his follow along his course. Up to the point of mental breakdown, of course, and then go on to have a successful concert career, which of course was a total pipe dream, because I started playing the piano far too late and was not talented, or not talented enough. So yeah. it does hold a special place in the heart, and I still play, obviously. As a child watching this, I was gripped by the musical side of things, but I think there are two parallel stories. There's one man's painful journey to virtuosity, with his overbearing father, breathing down his neck at every turn, putting enormous weight of expectation on his shoulders, and then obviously his spectacular fall and descent into an incredible psychological breakdown, and then of course his tentative climb back to, well, not stardom, but a life worth living. And then on the other hand, you've got this father's desperate attempts to hold his family together, ultimately totally misguided attempts to retain his family unit.
Yeah.
And his backstory, of course, is that he himself this is David Helfgott's father, was a survivor of the Holocaust. All his family wiped out by the Nazi scourge in World War II. I found myself as a dad, on the one hand, I was torn between, on the one hand, loathing David Helfgott's father for what he put him through, and also feeling tremendously sorry for him.
The actor that plays him does such an incredible job, because although the film never actually says anything about him, about his family being wiped out by the Nazis, but somehow there's moments where he feels like a sympathetic character, where he does seem loving to his children, and he wants to give them a hug, and he wants them to pursue their dreams, but it never really lasts, because his own anger towards his own upbringing, and the crucial element of the violin that got smashed that he saved up for, like that smashing of that violin sets about the entire course of this film in some ways, because that's the kind of linchpin in his own musical journey and in his upbringing, I suppose, to a degree. For me, in the rewatch, it was all those elements of the father-son journey and their relationship, which for me holds the movie together as more than the actual piano narrative. But it really struck me watching it again how prominent Noah Taylor is in. So this is teenage David. Because in my own head, I thought he was kind of the first half an hour, 40 minutes. But it's actually not until 1 hour, 4 minutes in that Geoffrey Rush effectively takes over the reins. But for a few backflashes. Yeah, it was just interesting rewatching it and actually seeing the different elements of, the three different people playing David, and even little things like they actually exchanged notes and made sure they put their glasses on in a certain way, and those little nuances that they all carried through, which made it feel like the same person. And a few weeks ago, Mark, we looked at Moneyball, and we said how the backflashes kind of take you out of it a little bit, because it's not Brad Pitt and it's just some actor. Whereas in this film, that never really happens. You never, the suspension of disbelief, that element never gets broken by the different actors playing that role. So it is a masterpiece, this film. But yeah, I get your point on it's not very Hollywood. If you think Independence Day came out the same year, so that kind of puts it into perspective a little bit.
So just zooming out, going back to the moment that this film was released, it's clear that it did very well. It got 6 or 7 Oscar nominations. I think it was a joint second for the most number of nominations that year. But, it's a movie that I could probably ask 9 out of 10 people whether they saw or whether they've seen it since, and they would likely say no. So this is, again, it fits well into this category of films that we, I think, are trying to put our finger on, that it essentially has been kind of missed somewhere down the line. So should we start by just talking about why, kind of zooming out and talking why that might be?
I think at the time that it was released, it had enough buzz and enough word of mouth that people did see it. And I even remember quite a bizarre reference, which you might know or you might not. But there's an episode of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the great Nickelodeon show, and Sabrina, the lead character, has got an issue, and she says, because she's going to be going to the cinema with a crush she has or something, and she says, "What do I do?" And her aunt says, "See Shine, everyone's raving about it." And for some reason, that's just a bizarre quote that I remember from an episode of Sabrina.
That's so funny.
I remember that now. I remember that now you're
you.
saying it, Steve.
Yeah, it's bizarre. She stayed with me. But since, there's a few things that I think are really surface level that I think could just stop people from watching it. So, you imagine someone's on Netflix or Amazon flicking through the films now, or even in a video store before they became irrelevant or went out of business. You look at that front cover and it doesn't really scream, "Take me home and watch me." The name of the film, Shine, doesn't tell you anything about the film. And the strapline, which is "because there's always light at the end of the tunnel," doesn't really tell you anything about the film.
It's a bit glib, isn't it?
Yeah, and even
Yeah.
and even him on the front cover, like we know in the movie, he's bouncing on a trampoline with sun lotion all over his nose. But when that's the cover, again, it's like it just seems really inaccessible. Whereas if this film was called The Pianist, like the film that came out 10 years later, you might have thought, oh, it might have just seemed a bit more tangible. Whereas I think those things are actually like massive factors in it not being retrospectively admired, perhaps.
There's something about Geoffrey Rush as the lead role. I mean, he's a bit of a depressing figure. I don't know what it is about. You might disagree.
No, I think you're right. It wasn't Dustin Hoffman. It could have been.
Yeah.
But they chose an Australian actor. I think he was primarily a theatre actor up until this point. This was
his first
one
movie.
of the earliest. Really, his very first film.
Yeah, so he was an acclaimed theatre actor, but hadn't done film. What do you think, Sam, in terms of why you think it might have got missed at the time? Or certainly since?
Yeah, I think, David Helfgott isn't a famous, well-known musician, even though he does have this compelling story. It's not a Hollywood theme. It's an Australian, pretty unheard of concert pianist who had a breakdown quite early on in his career and actually isn't particularly well regarded today as a sort of legitimate performer. There's a lot of sort of understanding about his condition and how all of that changed his trajectory. But yeah, it's a kind of a bit of a backwater story to begin with, and then the fact that so this is an interesting one. I'd like to talk about the rest of the cast because really this is a film that blends some pretty unheard of performers, in Noah Taylor, like we've talked about in Geoffrey Rush, but then it combines it with some like absolute heavy hitting, like older cast, like Sir John Gielgud. I think this is his final movie. You've got Lynn Redgrave of the kind of the Redgrave dynasty of great sort of Shakespearean actors, up there with Gielgud and Olivier, and so it's this interesting blend of like really well-known performers with this new cast.
Well, we've already talked about. I mean, he's a younger cast member, but Noah Taylor as the middle David Helfgott. I mean, he gives an absolutely stunning performance. And I think he's got the toughest job because obviously child David Helfgott has a particular role to play and he does it well. Probably not the most complex of performances to pull off, but as a young child, you have to give him his dues. Geoffrey Rush, of course, plays Helfgott in his older years and absolutely nails it. But Noah Taylor has to bridge that gap. He has to transition from the sort of the old, well, he's not, is he an old teenager? He's probably 17, 18, 19. He years under the thumb of his overbearing father, and he has to move from that to Geoffrey Rush, and you see the transformation. He starts to stutter. The nervous laugh comes in.
Staying on Noah Taylor for a second, I think you're absolutely right, Mark, because. And that's kind of what I was thinking, when I rewatched it and said about the amount of screen time he has. Because for Geoffrey Rush to even be nominated as leading actor is a bit of a stretch, because you could argue it's Noah Taylor and Geoffrey Rush is a supporting actor. Because Noah Taylor does a lot of the heavy lifting and, like you say, bridging the gap. And it's pretty damn seamless. Like, he does a really incredible job. And, he's gone on to have a decent career. That as an actor, he's cropped up in lots of things down the years, from Game of Thrones. He was in Vanilla Sky, the original Lara Croft Tomb Raider films.
He was in Peaky Blinders recently. Did you see that?
Yeah, Paddington 2. He's just one of those actors who's just good character actor, and he keeps recurring in things. But yeah, he does a really great job. And Geoffrey Rush's performance could seem really over the top, actually, if he hadn't done such a good job getting the character to that point.
I think that's true, although just diving into the movie a little bit, I found, just those opening few minutes, I feel like, Geoffrey Rush is the Shakespearean, seasoned, Oscar-winning, consummate this is, like you say, a bit of a tour de force. And I think the opening few minutes, the fact that they chose to open with him, even his face creeping into the side of the shot,
Yeah.
It just helps grab the audience by the neck. And I think for me, it felt like an announcement, like this is going to be an acting tour de force. The charm and all the wit and the fast rhyming and all that troubled sort of joy. Like, he's so watchable in every second he's on screen. And I think that's for me why he holds it together a little bit. And they do keep coming back to him at different points in the movie.
Yeah.
Even though we're plunged back into different parts of his childhood and his upbringing, I think, the Oscar, even for, I mean, if anything, it says, it speaks of how well he did with what time he had on screen.
Yeah.
That he won the Oscar. Because I think, that back half when we kind of return more or less exclusively to the Geoffrey Rush, David Helfgott, for me is where the, I don't know, just the gravity sort of returns, I feel like, when Geoffrey Rush is back on screen.
That's the timeline that you kind of, when it gets back there, you feel landed. And I know what you're saying. But yeah, going back to the kind of supporting cast, I think Armin Mueller-Stahl, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation there, but he plays Peter Helfgott, the dad, and I think he is just incredible. I've never seen him in anything else, but he just has this quiet, seething thing going on, and he's so subtle, just his watchfulness. You think of scenes where one of David's sisters is speaking to that young lad, and he's just watching in the window. When David's speaking to that girl at the recital at the top of the book, in that library kind of venue, he's just watching quietly, and you've always got this kind of quiet, seething thing going on. And I thought he was just fantastic.
There's a moment, isn't there, when David finds out. David's given the offer of, and we should probably say before he goes to the Royal College of Music, David is offered a place in a really eminent music school in the US. I think Isaac Stern, who's a virtuosic concert pianist, is traveling in Australia, and he offers David a place in this auspicious music college. And in the beginning, is it Peter Helfgott? Peter Helfgott?
Yeah.
Peter Helfgott appears on the face of it to be reasonably supportive. And gradually you feel his discomfort, not only with the fact that he's going to lose his son to America, and who knows what will happen to him when he goes over there, but also that he will lose his control, and he is very much a man who likes being in control of things, not just in control of himself, but in control of his offspring, and I dare say his wife. But there's a scene where his discomfort reaches boiling point, and I think David is going along to collect some award, and the crowd is lauding upon David, congratulations and plaudits and encouragements, and the camera just zooms up to Peter Helfgott, and there's just this, he's just staring. And it's almost like a cow's stare, where you think, what on earth is going on behind those eyes? But you know that he's not happy. You know that it's at the point where he's thought, right, enough's enough. I'm not tolerating this charade any longer.
Yeah.
And then they're back in the house in the next scene, and David and his sisters are talking about he's going to America, because up until that point it's assumed, and Peter Helfgott just loses the plot completely. And what are you talking about, you fools? David's not going to America.
Yeah.
You think, what? You think, oh my, he's lost the plot here. He's taken leave of his senses, but he delivers it impeccably.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was nominated for an Oscar himself as a supporting actor, and I just agree that he's just arresting immediately. He's got this huge presence in the film. He swings, like you said, between sort of pretty full-blown violent abuse, but carries this sort of insidious, this quiet pressure the whole time. And you mentioned earlier, Steve, there were moments of kind of warmth and no, I think you mentioned he's kind of sympathetic in a way, and I think he is because he's suffered so much and lost his family, and that's clearly had this, overarching effect on him. But I found it really difficult to find him warm, even in those moments. Like there's a scene early on where the young David Helfgott's been just trying to learn the early bars of the Rachmaninoff Third Piano Concerto.
Yeah.
Something he really shouldn't be doing as such a young pianist. This thing is way beyond him and his emotion and his skill, but he's doing it really just to please his father, who wants him to learn this piece so desperately for some reason. And it's this kind of warm, he kind of sidles up to him, and it's this candlelit scene. But even there, man, I felt like this sort of sinister. There's this underbelly. Everything is so manipulative, and even in that scene, he kind of exposes his hand, and all his, I guess his philosophy about just winning, and there's so much pride and sort of hubris in him. I found it really difficult to find him warm, and we'll definitely talk about the scene, his last scene in the movie, where he revisits the oldest incarnation of David Helfgott again for one last time. But even in that scene, still he's trying to impress his superiority, his, all of that stuff on the relationship, and it doesn't get reconciled. It doesn't end with any kind of any joy.
So it's probably worth just jumping into some of the scenes that stood out for us. Sam, kick us off with any moments that you felt were noteworthy.
Yeah, I mean, my two favorite scenes, the one I loved, as a younger viewer, and the one I still love today, is that bullied upstaging the bully scene where he walks into the wine bar in Australia, and he's obviously unusual and strange and sort of, like most people would, if a sort of jabbering kind of somebody who's escaped literally from the psychiatric hospital walks into your wine bar, you sort of treat them with some caution. And you've got this great scene where he walks in, and oh no, here he is again, and this kind of this weirdo, and you've got the guy who clearly plays the piano at the wine bar as this. I don't know who the guy is, but he manages to make enough impact in this movie that I can recall his face anytime I want to. But he starts mocking.
Just not his name.
Yeah, just not his name. Yeah, he starts mocking him. Says, "Oh, sock it to us, Liberace. Come on, then. Show us what you've got." And David Helfgott sits and just launches into the flight of the Bumblebee, which is obviously this incredibly impressive piece of virtuosic showmanship, and he has the whole restaurant enraptured, and it's just one of those memorable scenes that where you really see there's some redemption happening here, he's coming back, but just to see the sort of the newfound success in that moment, I love that scene.
I mean, it's the ultimate hold my beer scene, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's wonderful to watch the bully being upstaged and then just sort of slinking away into the background.
I don't think you ever see him again. He doesn't crop up.
The very next scene is the restaurant with a new grand piano having been installed.
A little bow tie on David.
David entertaining the masses.
I love that the film doesn't even give that guy the credit to write him out. He's just gone.
Well, you can read between the lines, can't you?
You can.
What's really, really worth saying, and I think it's probably seen most impressively as well in that scene, is that Geoffrey Rush, who is a bit of an accomplished musician, did all of his own kind of hand double work on this. And, there's a few moments where it shows, but by and large, the Flight of the Bumblebee, he plays the Hungarian Rhapsody later on. And it's pretty darn good. And it's great to see, his, we're not cutting between someone else's hands and Geoffrey Rush. It's you're seeing him as a whole person perform and play this instrument. And I think, man, that's another reason that I think probably garnered Geoffrey Rush some of that extra, accolade at the Oscar ceremony.
Some of the other scenes that are kind of quite small moments, but I love anything that kind of serves the bridge between the different timelines. So there's the great moment when adult David, so Jeffrey Rush, is walking along and just does the pattern of the hopscotch that the child David does in the first scene, walking away from the piano recital. Little things like that, just they're really sweet moments.
Tie everything together.
Yeah, and there's also, even rewatching it, when David's walking towards the piano in the very first scene, there's this kind of like slow, echoey clapping going on, and it's almost like somehow foreshadows what happens when he's playing the Rack 3 and has the breakdown, because it does the sound and the audio does the same thing. It goes into this faint, echoey, and it's a really subtle thing, and I can't even say for sure that it's intentional. But on the rewatch, it kind of even subconsciously serves to tie those elements together.
So can I just quickly jump in, Martin? We each time we watch one of these movies, and it's something I try and do now, is there's usually for me like a scene that, I don't know, I feel like everything kind of revolves around this moment. Like it's the grit at the middle of the pearl, it's the sort of the central nugget scene. And for me, we touched on it earlier, but it's the scene when Peter Helfgott returns for one last time to visit David Helfgott. And so it's father and son again in the same room. And it's the first time you see... this scene is Jeffrey Rush and Armin Mueller-Stahl on their most on form. And, it's the first time that you see Jeffrey Rush a bit sort of withdrawn. He almost looks a bit afraid. And it's also the first time that Peter Helfgott is really kind of broken. He's really fighting to hold back tears, and he's in agony at what he's sort of allowed to happen. And you mentioned it, Steve, but it's almost the picture that crystallizes the David Helfgott, the whole David Helfgott story about this smashed piano. And there's a scene early on in the movie where
the violin,
the violin, sorry, where there's a scene earlier on in the movie where his father is telling him the story about how he saved up and bought this violin and his father smashed it. It's this heartbreaking insight into the pain of his own childhood. And it comes full circle in this scene later on in the movie, and he repeats his telling of this violin story that his father smashed, but this time around David Helfgott doesn't remember anymore. He doesn't remember the punchline.
My reading of that was that David Helfgott did know the answer to the question, and that was the first time in his life. That was where he'd stood up to his father. That was his way of saying.
Wow, that's really
his way
interesting.
Of saying, "No,
I'm not going to go along with this anymore.
I'm done with this." I think earlier in the scene he does repeat something like, "I'm a very lucky boy," but at that moment he says, "No."
So every week we try to, just because we don't want to just wax lyrical the entire time, we like to highlight, are there any issues in the movies, and is there anything that might have affected how well it did? So Mark, anything for you?
One of the criticisms that I've heard of this film as I've been researching in the run up to the podcast was that it doesn't have any third act complication. Every film has, the third act, you think everything's going well, and then something comes out of left field and it it puts the cat among the pigeons. But I think there is in this film, and I think that's the moment. I think the moment where David Helfgott's father re-enters the scene, and you think, oh no, David's made all this progress, he's finally getting his life back together, and in comes his overbearing, manipulative, tyrannical father, and he's going to ruin his life again. And then that's how I've always viewed this scene, that David is standing up to his father and saying, no way.
Yeah.
And then he says, and his sort of longing goodbye through the window. I think that's sort of almost a tacit acknowledgement that I'll never see you again.
Yeah.
And that's probably okay.
What about you, Sam?
Yeah, I've got a few this time, if you could indulge me, and I don't think it makes it a movie that you shouldn't go and see at all, but I think this is a small, but there's the scenes with John Gielgud and he says the line, "No one's ever been mad enough to attempt the Rack 3," you know, and it's just rubbish. It's nonsense. It's like it's firmly in the repertoire for a fair few concert musicians, and has been and continues to be. And so the idea that this piece of music is what broke him is just unhelpful. I think it contributes, but certainly isn't. No one's ever been mad enough to attempt the Rack 3. It just seems weird.
Well, I thought the same thing. I thought the same thing there, Sam. But I then wondered, was that at that point in their career for their performance piece in the Royal College of Music? I wondered if that's what he was saying.
Maybe Cecil Parks knows that this guy is a little bit fragile and shouldn't go near the thing. But anyway, that was one. Another one was for a movie that's centered around classical music. The score feels a bit anemic. I think there's some really nice, beautiful moments in there, but it sort of feels. I think you get the feeling they ran out of cash a little bit. It's not very symphonic. It's quite sort of digital piano and some strings. It's not a particularly sort of rich score, even though there's some really nice moments. And I think he did get nominated for an Oscar, but that probably speaks more to the budget and so on.
For me, I think the ending feels a bit abrupt. And in some ways, seeing his grave is kind of like, okay, that kind of wraps it up. But I think the moment they left it with him walking away felt more powerful, and that should have been where that relationship, as far as that the story this film is telling. And it felt more
although
like,
there's a liberation about that scene. He's with his new wife, and his father's dead, and they literally walk off into the sunset together, and he seems sort of quite happy and normal at that point.
In terms of it feeling cinematic, and this is probably going back to it feeling like an Australian film, there's the moment where he performs his concert at the end of the film, and this time the director shows the glasses at the end of the Rack 3, and obviously he tries to take them and then falls. And that's like the beginning of his proper breakdown. And I think it's almost a like-for-like shot of his glasses on the piano. But this time he picks them up successfully, stands up, gets this amazing standing ovation, and, tears up. And it's just this epic moment.
Yeah.
And I could just see that fading to black and saying, like, on screen, David and Gillian now live, in whatever. But
maybe that should have been the last scene.
Yeah, for me, it should have been. Because then you go from that to them just by the grave, and it's not a very long scene or emotionally weighty. And because David doesn't seem to feel anything, as a viewer, I didn't really feel anything watching it. And then it just pans up to the sky, and that's the end. So it almost makes you feel like they're going to go into another act of the film, but it just stops. So for me, that's, it's an artistic choice they went for. But I think the parallel of the glasses, and then, but this time he's able to receive that applause, probably felt like a better moment for me.
Yeah, and there's a little line that I've never caught before, but watching it with the subtitles, he does that performance, and, the crowd's on their feet, and he's kind of, receiving all this warmth and love, despite having gone through all this stuff. But he leans down and he hugs Gillian, and he just whispers a couple of times, and you can barely hear it. He says, "I'm going to win. I'm going to win. I'm going to win." And it's this heartbreaking sort of echo back to those early years and the pressure from his father. And it's almost like, it's heartwarming because he really is kind of sort of back, as it were. But the fact that that's still there in his subconscious was something that I'd missed on previous watching.
I also think one weakness in the story, and this is not the story's fault because this is just reality, is that I was always quite disappointed when I learned that, ex post facto after the event, that David Helfgott's actually not that great a pianist. You touched on it earlier, Sam, but he of course he can play the Rack 3, but not very well. And we knew someone, as you did, Sam, who was a concert pianist. And I remember when he said, "Oh, David Helfgott, oh golly, he's viewed by professional pianists as a joke. He's not very good at all." And I always thought that was quite disappointing. I mean, it would have been much nicer if actually he did go on to have a highly successful, eminent concert career.
Yeah, and it's worth saying he's still alive. I think he still performs and does recitals here and there, particularly in Australia.
Yeah. But one does feel that it's a bit of a spectacle, and that it's probably his fame post the film Shine that has led to his has led to the attraction of seeing him perform live, rather than because of his virtuosity.
Well, thanks so much for listening / watching. That was another episode of Unmissable Movies. Mark, it was great to have you with us. I hope you enjoyed being a part of it.
Yeah, thanks for joining in, Mark. It's great.
My pleasure.
And we'll be back next week with another film. You can get in contact with us if you want to suggest anything by all the social media channels, pretty much, bar TikTok, and just search Unmissable Movies. And as I said before, our email is unmissablemoviescontact@gmail.com. Thanks very much.
Cheery bye.
Ta-ta for now.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed that, don't forget to click the like button. You can share this with your friends on Twitter and Facebook, TikTok probably. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about all our latest videos. And finally, if you're able to support the channel, please do follow the Patreon link in the video description. You'll get a load of bonus content from outtakes to shoutouts and a bunch of other stuff. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.